A long-forgotten photograph held a story within its gaze, one that had never seen the light of day. A story some tried to bury, others had long since abandoned in fear. But when Miss Marple uncovered a hidden truth, one thing became undeniable. Some truths can never stay hidden, and those who try to bury them must face the most dangerous realities of all. Are you ready to uncover the secret that has been buried for decades? The morning air was crisp and invigorating, a chill that seemed to lift the spirits as it swept through the village. It was the kind of morning that Miss Marple always found agreeable, the kind that felt like a promise of things to come, when the world was just waking up from a night's slumber. She had just settled into her favorite chair by the window, a freshly knitted scarf draped across her lap, a steaming cup of tea at her side, the warm scent of it filling the room. The quiet of the morning was interrupted only by the soft patter of the postman's footsteps outside. The usual collection of letters arrived, bills, a note from her niece, and then one that immediately caught her attention. It was different. The envelope was thick, its edges worn, the paper yellowed with age, giving it the appearance of something that had been hidden away for years. The handwriting, elegant yet trembling, had a certain weight to it. The name written across the front, Elena Carstairs, stirred a forgotten memory in Miss Marple's mind, a name that belonged to a time long past. As she unfolded the letter, the ink smudged in places, as though it had been written in haste or fear. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the words quickly. My dear Miss Marple, I write to you in urgent need. There are matters, long concealed, that must now come to light. I fear that the shadows of my past are closing in, and I do not feel safe. Please, if you can, come to Cast's Manor. I am afraid it is the only place left for me. The letter was brief, and yet it left a chilling sense of urgency in its wake. No explanations followed, no details of the danger that Elena feared. But Miss Marple knew instinctively that this was not a trivial matter. She had read enough letters steeped in fear to recognize the unmistakable tremor of truth. Elena's words carried the weight of desperation, the kind of fear that only comes from something deeply personal, something buried for far too long. As she placed the letter down on the table, Miss Marple gazed out of the window, her mind already racing, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that came rushing back. Elena Carstairs had once been a striking woman, the sort of person who effortlessly commanded attention, a woman whose presence filled any room she entered. To think that she was now reduced to sending a letter like this, pleading for help, spoke volumes about the kind of fear she was living with. The terror that had haunted her for so long had finally surfaced, and it was evident that something dreadful had unsettled Elena's world, something that she had kept hidden for years, perhaps even decades. Miss Marple had always believed that the past had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. The village of St. Mary's had seen its fair share of quiet tragedies, lives upended by small, seemingly insignificant moments, that would in time become stories of whispered gossip. But this was different. Elena Carstairs was different. The letter felt heavier in her hands as she turned it over, considering what had been left unsaid. Shadows. Elena had written about shadows. What kind of shadows could haunt a woman of such strength and grace? What secret, long buried, had Elena been running from all these years? Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the hushed conversations she had overheard over the years. There had been talk, vague and fragmented, about Elena's past, a tragedy involving a girl who had vanished. Cecilia, that was her name. But the details had always been unclear, lost in time and the polite silence of the English countryside, where stories were often buried beneath layers of civility and propriety. Yet Elena had reached out, not to the police, not to an old friend, but to her. Miss Marple's heart quickened with a sense of foreboding. Something terrible was unfolding, and Miss Marple knew that this was just the beginning. Before Miss Marple could make any decisions about her next steps, news arrived that would change everything. At the post office, Mrs. Jenkins, the postmistress, leaned over the counter, her voice low but filled with urgency. Terrible news, Miss Marple, she said, glancing around the room as if afraid the walls themselves might be listening. It's about Elena Carstairs. They found her, dead, in the garden of Cast's Manor, early this morning. Miss Marple's fingers tightened instinctively around her handbag. The news was shocking, but it didn't feel entirely unexpected. An accident? She asked quietly, though her voice betrayed no real hope for such an explanation. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, Miss Marple. Doesn't sit right with me, not at all. Doesn't sit right with anyone here. Miss Marple felt a chill run through her, but it wasn't from the cold morning air. The weight of Mrs. Jenkins' words settled into her bones. She stepped out of the post office, the letter still tucked firmly in her pocket. Its words now a burning question in her mind. What had Elena discovered? What had she been so terrified of that she had sought help after all these years of silence? As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her thoughts were clouded by a growing sense of unease. She knew in her heart that this was no accident. No, Elena Carstairs had not died by accident. She had died because she knew something that someone did not want uncovered. The shadows of Elena's past had finally found her, and they had taken her life to keep their secrets hidden. When Miss Marple arrived at Carst's Manor, the house loomed before her, its ivy-clad facade now softened by the passing years. There was something unsettling about it now, a stillness in the air that did not feel natural. The grandeur of the house had been weathered by time, but it was the silence that unsettled her most. Miss Marple stepped through the heavy oak doors, greeted by hesitant glances from the few people who remained. Lydia Fairfax, Elena's long-serving housekeeper, stood stiffly in the dimly lit hall, her eyes shadowed by something Miss Marple could not quite read. "You'll want to see the study," Lydia said finally, her voice controlled, but her hands betraying her anxiety, twisting the folds of her apron. Miss Marple nodded, her senses heightened, taking in every detail of the room. The table was polished but untouched, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. A vase of wilted flowers sat atop the mantel, their faded petals offering a silent testimony to the passage of time. The faint scent of old paper lingered in the air, but there was something else beneath it, something acrid and bitter. Before she could question further, a figure emerged from the drawing room. Julian Carstairs, Elena's nephew, appeared, his expensive suit betraying his family's wealth, but his expression was tight, strained. The lines on his face suggested something far more complicated than a simple heir to an estate. Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was more to his tension than he was willing to admit. The questions, the whispers, the mystery, all were growing, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them, piece by piece. She knew that whatever had happened to Elena, whatever had been concealed, was a story that was far from over. The shadows of the past had only just begun to reveal themselves, and Miss Marple would not rest until the truth came to light. Miss Marple remained composed, but something in her heart stirred with unease, as she heard the words fall from Julian Carstairs' lips. "A dreadful accident," he said, his voice too quick, his tone rehearsed, as though it were an answer he had given countless times before, a story repeated until it lost its meaning. The word accident hung in the air, but Miss Marple was no fool. The way he averted his gaze, the subtle impatience in his stance, spoke volumes. It was the look of a man who wished the matter to be closed, a man who wanted no questions asked, no further digging into the events that had led to the tragic death of his aunt. The house was filled with others like him, polite, somber, but distant, careful in their responses, as if they feared saying too much. There was no grief in the air, only an eerie quiet that seemed to press against her chest, the kind that settled deep in places long untouched. Miss Marple had seen this before in houses of old money, where secrets were buried so deeply that the dead never truly rested. When she entered Elena's study, everything was as expected, neat, organized, but it was the small things that caught Miss Marple's trained eye. A drawer, locked but with the key left carelessly on the desk, a subtle hint of carelessness, or was it? She didn't believe in carelessness. Inside the drawer, among receipts and letters yellowed by time, was a single folded note. The paper was delicate, fragile, even, and the ink was faded, but the message was clear. It read, "She knows the truth, but does she remember?" Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, the words echoing in her mind. Not a statement, but a question, a warning perhaps, or a fragment of a memory long buried. Had Elena discovered something, or was she only now beginning to remember something that should have stayed forgotten? Lydia Fairfax lingered in the doorway, her gaze flickering nervously toward the note in Miss Marple's hands. "Miss Carstairs," she began, her voice low, hesitant. She was troubled, you understand. She would write things down, things that didn't always make sense. Miss Marple nodded, tucking the note into her pocket, but it made perfect sense to her. The past had been knocking at Elena's door for far too long, and now it seemed, the door had finally broken open. The road to Cast's Manor was long and winding, the trees that lined the path nothing more than gnarled skeletons, their branches reaching toward the heavens like desperate hands. The house itself emerged from the thick mist of trees, grand and imposing, but tired, its walls sagging beneath the weight of forgotten years. The windows, once polished to gleaming brilliance, now stood clouded and grim, as though they, too, hesitated to look upon the secrets locked within. When Miss Marple stepped from the carriage, she felt an immediate heaviness in the air, as though time itself had stopped in this place, trapping something far more sinister inside. Lydia Fairfax opened the door before Miss Marple had the chance to knock, her face an impassive mask, but her body language betrayed her. There was tension in the way she held herself, a rigidity that hinted at something more. "We weren't expecting visitors," Lydia said, her tone controlled, yet not quite convincing. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She simply entered, noting the scent of old wood, faded perfume, and something else, a faint almost imperceptible unease that lingered in the air like dust settling on forgotten furniture. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, the sound unsettling in its punctuality, marking the passage of time in a house where time seemed to have been forgotten. Lydia led her through the dim corridors of the manor, her footsteps measured, deliberate. There was a quiet resolve in her movements, as if she had seen and heard too much in her years of service to this house. She was a woman who understood the shadows that lingered in every corner. Miss Marple had been in many such homes over the years, places where tragedies were not just moments of sorrow, but lingering presences, hovering over the house like a constant oppressive weight. "You were with Miss Carstairs for many years?" Miss Marple asked softly, her gaze never leaving Lydia's tense form. The housekeeper's eyes tightened at the question, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "I was," Lydia replied, her voice steady but distant. "As well as anyone could be." Her words were carefully measured, but Miss Marple caught the hint of something more, something between the lines of the polite reply. Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the subtle shift in Lydia's posture, the slight tremble in her hands as she clutched her apron. There was grief, yes, but it was buried beneath something far more dangerous, caution, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple followed her gaze, as Lydia glanced nervously toward the staircase, her eyes lingering there for just a moment too long, before returning to the present. She wasn't herself these past few weeks, Lydia admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She kept saying she heard things, that someone had been in the house. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind turning over the details, the shadows of fear that had touched Elena's life in the days before her death. Fear always left its mark, its fingerprints were always visible if one knew where to look. She wasn't sure what had happened here, but she was certain of one thing, something had been buried for far too long. And now the past had come back with a vengeance, threatening to tear apart everything in its path. The question remained, was it too late to uncover the truth, or had the darkness already claimed its prize? Miss Marple stepped into the room with quiet determination, her presence barely disrupting the stillness that hung in the air. Lydia Fairfax stood stiffly by the door, her every movement calculated, as if trying to hide the weight of something unspeakable. Her eyes flickered towards the doorway, betraying her unease. "We weren't expecting anyone, Miss Marple," she said, her voice measured, though the tremor beneath it was hard to ignore. "I can see that," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside, her gaze sweeping over the room with quiet scrutiny. The heavy scent of old furniture and forgotten secrets filled the air, mingling with a coldness that was not entirely due to the draft in the room. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the subtle signs, the tightness in Lydia's posture, the way she avoided meeting her gaze for too long. "You've been with the family for many years, I understand?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. Lydia's hands stiffened at her sides, but she kept her face impassive. Yes, Miss Marple, for many years. Her voice was tight, each word measured. And Miss Carstairs, Miss Marple prodded. She was different these past few weeks. Lydia's voice faltered, the cracks in her composure momentarily visible. She kept hearing things. Footsteps in the hall, whispers at night, someone in the house. Lydia hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to stretch across the room, deep and ominous. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. And you didn't believe her? Lydia's face tightened, but she didn't answer directly. A tragedy, she said finally, her words flat. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. There was something more beneath Lydia's words, something she wasn't saying. As they continued down the hallway, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle tensions in the house, the hurried glances, the silence that lingered a little too long in response to her questions. When they reached the drawing room, Julian Carstairs was waiting, standing stiffly by the fire. His posture was casual, almost rehearsed, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted around the room as though searching for something or someone. A terrible business, he said with a strained smile, his words practiced, though the lack of true sorrow was unmistakable. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. Do you believe it was an accident? She asked, her voice carrying the weight of her inquiry. Julian's smile faltered for a split second, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his response. Of course, he said too quickly. What else could it be? His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple had long since learned to read the subtle signals, the flicker of unease in his eyes, the tightness around his mouth. She didn't press him further, but tucked the observation away for later.
Doctor.
Miles Barton, the family doctor, was just as hurried to dismiss the matter. A fall, Miss Marple, simple as that, he said, his tone final. But Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation when he spoke. The details were too neat, too perfect, and there was a subtle impatience in his voice, as though he was eager to close the door on this case before it could open fully. Miss Marple's mind churned as she asked herself, why the rush to settle things? The Forsyth couple, old neighbors, had been oddly quiet at the wake, their expressions stiff, as though they too were hiding something beneath the surface. Henry, with his nervous glances, and Alice with her unnerving smile, both carried the scent of secrets in their silence. When Miss Marple approached them, Alice's smile remained in place, though her grip on her wineglass tightened ever so slightly. It's a dreadful business, she remarked casually. Terrible, Henry muttered under his breath, but Miss Marple noticed the tremor in his voice, the way Alice's smile faltered for a mere moment. It must be unsettling to lose someone so suddenly. Miss Marple continued gently, watching their reactions closely. Alice's smile didn't falter, but her voice dropped just enough to suggest something darker beneath. Some things, she said softly, are best left undisturbed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Alice's face, the words echoing in her mind. She had heard them before, often from those who had far too much to hide. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple stood in the dim hallway, the weight of the house's secrets pressing in on her. Lydia had retreated, and the others were lost in their quiet exchanges, but the air felt thick with something unsaid, something unacknowledged. Miss Marple's mind spun with the possibilities, each clue leading her closer to the truth. The tragedy of Eleanor Carstairs might have seemed simple to those around her, but Miss Marple knew that the surface rarely told the full story, and in this house of lingering secrets, the past was never far behind. The house seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple lingered, her gaze shifting between the shadowed corners and the silent walls of Carstairs Manor. The air was thick with secrets, and every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet whispered of things left unsaid. Julian Carstairs had been polite, almost painfully so, his smile too practiced, his eyes too guarded. His words, smooth but hollow, were those of a man who knew the weight of debts, not just of money but of guilt, pressing down on his shoulders. His quick dismissal of the tragedy, calling it merely an accident, rang false in the stillness of the room. Yet it was the flicker in his eyes, the way he glanced toward the door, as if already planning his escape, that gave him away. There was more to his aunt's death, something darker, something unfinished. Miss Marple had heard the murmurs in the village, the half-formed whispers that suggested foul play, where none had been acknowledged. The Dr. Barton too, seemed eager to close the case, his impatience barely concealed behind the words, nothing more than a misstep. But his haste to sweep the matter under the rug, his sharp, quick certainty, betrayed a nervousness that Miss Marple could almost taste. She had learned long ago that people, when faced with uncomfortable truths, rushed to ignore them, to bury them deep. And Dr. Barton, for all his professional detachment, was no exception. Alice and Henry Forsyth, the closest of neighbors, were no less intriguing. Their subdued presence at the wake, the way they avoided Miss Marple's gaze, spoke volumes. Alice's tight grip on her wine glass, the nervous twitch in Henry's throat as he spoke of the tragedy. These were not the reactions of people burdened by grief, but those hiding something far more sinister. Their unease was palpable, a dance of glances and unspoken words. Some things are best left undisturbed, Alice had murmured, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. But Miss Marple had heard such words before. They were always a prelude to something darker. Later, as the house fell into silence, Miss Marple found herself standing in the dimly lit hallway of the manor, feeling the weight of the years pressing in on her. Lydia Fairfax, the old friend, had been the last to leave, her eyes clouded with something unreadable, perhaps guilt or fear, as she whispered of Elena's growing paranoia before her death. She thought she saw someone watching her, Lydia confessed, her voice trembling. The truth was in the shadows, in the things Elena had hidden from everyone, most of all herself. The study door creaked as Miss Marple entered, the room still neat and composed, an illusion of order. But it was the bookshelves that caught her attention. Her fingers traced the spines of the books, and there, nestled between them, was the journal, hidden, protected. Elena's handwriting filled the pages, her thoughts frantic, scattered. The name Cecilia Harrington leapt from the page, an echo from the past, a name that had haunted Elena for years. A drowning, they had said. An accident. But Elena had never believed it. The ink in the journal grew darker as the entries became more desperate, more urgent. Elena had seen Cecilia after the death. The revelation struck Miss Marple with a force she could not ignore. If Cecilia had drowned, if she had died all those years ago, why was Elena so certain she had lived? Why had the memory of Cecilia's face haunted Elena in the years that followed? It was not a coincidence that Elena had died now, not a mere misstep as they claimed. No, this was something more, a reckoning with the past, a past that had been waiting, patient and unyielding. Miss Marple closed the journal gently, her mind racing. The villagers had been too quick to offer their opinions, but the truth was buried deeper than any of them could imagine. It was a truth that someone had been willing to kill for, and now Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, no matter where it led. The wind howled through the branches outside, rattling the windows of the old manor as if echoing the secrets it held within its stone walls. Miss Marple stood motionless by the window, her sharp eyes tracing the dark figure lingering by the garden hedge, half hidden in the shadows, a presence that felt far too deliberate, too purposeful. The figure remained still, almost as though waiting for something, waiting for her, perhaps. She didn't move, not even an inch, but her mind raced, picking apart the clues scattered across the night like breadcrumbs. The figure melted into the darkness as swiftly as it had appeared, and Miss Marple felt an unsettling chill creep down her spine. She turned her attention to the house, her fingers tracing the edge of the worn patterned wallpaper that lined the hallway. There was something about the silence here, a thick, suffocating stillness that clung to every corner. The manor had always felt heavy with history, but tonight, it felt as though that history was breathing, alive, and watching. The morning came shrouded in a thick mist, creeping across the grounds, enveloping Carstairs Manor in an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. Miss Marple descended to breakfast, her mind already piecing together fragments of the puzzle. Cecilia Harrington's death had always been a tragic accident, they said. The river had claimed her, swift, merciless. But Elena Carstairs had never believed that, had she? The journal hidden away in the study, the cryptic messages from Elena's final days, they all pointed toward a deeper, darker truth. And now it seemed, someone was willing to go to any lengths to bury that truth once and for all. Lydia Fairfax, the lady of the house, poured tea with a shaky hand, her eyes flickering toward Miss Marple's unyielding gaze. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice tight, as though trying to maintain control of a storm just beneath the surface. Miss Marple gave a small measured smile, her fingers tapping lightly on her teacup. "Well enough," she replied, her voice calm, though inside, her mind was whirling. "Though I wonder if anyone else has seen anything unusual near the estate. A stranger, perhaps." Lydia's grip on the teapot tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No," she answered, but the hesitation in her voice was telling. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Elena had been haunted by something far beyond mere grief, far beyond what the others had believed. There was more to Cecilia's disappearance, something far darker, and someone, who had long been a part of this house, was desperate to keep those secrets buried. The threads of this mystery were tightening, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting them slip away unnoticed. A shadow of regret lingered in the air, and she could almost taste the fear that had clung to Elena's last days. There were whispers, faint and distant, but Miss Marple could hear them, threading their way through the silence like a faint melody, each whisper more telling than the last. This was no accident. The truth had been buried long enough, and it was ready to surface. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her resolve firm. The past had returned, and this time, it would not be denied. The room was heavy with the weight of unsaid words, the air thick with unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple sat silently, her gaze steady as the Reverend shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his worn Bible. "It's true," he finally murmured, almost as though he were confessing something that had long been buried in the deepest recesses of his mind. "Cecilia, I saw her that night, not a ghost, not a vision, just her, standing there by the boathouse, as real as you or me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind clicking into place. No one had believed Elena, but Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust the whispers of the past, especially when they were accompanied by such persistent doubts. She could see it in the Reverend's eyes, the regret, the guilt, the knowledge that he had never been able to fully grasp the truth of what had happened. She rose from her seat with quiet precision, her steps deliberate as she moved toward the desk. The room was still, the silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers beneath her fingers as she sifted through Elena's neatly organized files. It was the ledger that caught her attention, its pages worn, the ink faded with time, yet the entries remained sharp and clear, unmistakable. Payments, irregular, disguised beneath vague notations. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't a household account. This was something far darker, blackmail. The realization settled into her bones, chilling and absolute. Elena had been paying someone to keep her secrets buried. But who? And why had she waited until the very last moments of her life to make her final payment? Miss Marple closed the ledger with a heavy sigh. Elena had tried to protect herself, but in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. Julian Carstairs, with his carefully maintained composure, sat across from her, exuding an air of calm that Miss Marple knew too well to trust. His fingers tapped the edge of his glass, the faintest tremor betraying his unease. "I was in London," he stated smoothly, his words careful, rehearsed. "Several people can confirm it." Miss Marple's gaze didn't falter, her voice soft but laced with a knowing edge. "And yet you returned almost immediately after your aunt's passing," she observed. "A rather swift journey, wouldn't you say?" Julian's jaw tightened, but his smile remained in place, though it no longer reached his eyes. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, unwavering. "Only that grief, like truth, has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it." The flicker of uncertainty was brief, but it was enough. A crack in the facade. Julian exhaled sharply, his smile faltering for the briefest moment before he regained control. Miss Marple, you are a guest in this house. I would hate for you to overstep. She met his warning with quiet resolve, her voice soft but unyielding. I've never been one to heed such warnings, Mr. Carstairs, especially when there's so much at stake. As Miss Marple sat alone in the study, Elena's journal resting gently in her hands, the weight of the mystery seemed to press down on her. The pages were worn, the handwriting frantic, as though the writer had been struggling to keep up with the pounding of her own thoughts. The story it told was one of a girl, Cecilia Harrington, who had vanished, drowned, they had said. But no body had ever been recovered. And now, years later, Elena Carstairs, perhaps the only person who had ever doubted the official story, was dead. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edges of the journal, her mind racing through the implications. The patterns, the hidden payments, the restless whispers of the past, it was all starting to fall into place. Elena had known something about Cecilia's death, something someone had killed for. As she closed the journal, the storm outside seemed to gather strength, a furious wind rising as the skies darkened. The past was not done with them. It was waiting, patient and unforgiving, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth it, no matter what it took. The truth was buried deep, but Miss Marple could feel it, pulsing just beneath the surface, ready to break free. In the dim musty corners of Carstairs Manor, the air held an unnerving stillness as Miss Marple sat by the window, her mind weaving through the dark tapestry of secrets that had lingered far too long beneath the surface. Her thoughts were deliberate, methodical, each fragment falling into place like pieces of an intricate puzzle. She had seen it before, a hidden past too tightly bound to ever be fully forgotten, and the inevitable unraveling of truths long buried. Eleanor Carrere had been silenced, and the depths of her silence now echoed louder than ever, each whisper of the past pulling Miss Marple deeper into the labyrinth of mystery. The knock at the door was soft, but it broke the tension, and Lydia Fairfax stepped inside, her expression anxious. Miss Marple, she began, her voice tinged with caution, you must be careful. The old woman's gaze sharpened, her curiosity piqued. Why? She asked, her tone unassuming, yet keen with an undercurrent of understanding. Lydia hesitated, her hands twisting nervously, the words hanging between them like a cloud before a storm. Some things are better left undisturbed, Lydia murmured. Miss Marple smiled gently, a smile that barely touched the edges of her eyes. Ah, my dear, she replied softly, the past is never at rest, and secrets are like ghosts, they are always waiting to be found. As Lydia departed, Miss Marple's mind churned. She was no stranger to danger, to the peril that came when secrets became too much to bear, and Lydia's cryptic warning only heightened the sense of foreboding that had begun to creep through the manor. The next morning, chaos erupted, a blood-curdling scream sliced through the calm, and Miss Marple rushed to the window, her eyes narrowing as she saw the gathering in the garden. In the center, amidst the tangled overgrowth, lay Lydia Fairfax, her body still and lifeless, the white collar of her uniform askew, the faint imprint of a silk scarf around her neck. It was clear, Lydia had been silenced, a victim of deliberate violence, her life extinguished in the most calculated of ways. Miss Marple moved with an unsettling calm, her years of experience guiding her every step. She surveyed the scene, Lydia's still hands curled in a final plea for help, the disturbed earth beneath her, and the faint trace of footprints leading back toward the house. This was no random act, this was a carefully orchestrated murder. The shock that rippled through the household was palpable, but Miss Marple knew better than to mistake grief for fear. This wasn't mourning, it was the kind of fear that clawed at the edges of the mind, the kind that came when people knew they were living in the presence of something far more sinister than death itself. Julian Carrere, usually so composed, paced restlessly by the fireplace. 2 deaths in one house, he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. This is madness. Miss Marple's eyes remained steady, her voice unwavering as she counted. Madness or method, Julian? The flicker of unease in his eyes was unmistakable. He had been trying to maintain his composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. He had been too careful, too polished, and now the pressure was threatening to break him. The night before, Lydia had confided in Miss Marple, her voice trembling as she warned that some secrets were best left undisturbed. Now she had paid the ultimate price for knowing too much. The killer had tried to frighten Miss Marple into retreat, but they had miscalculated. Miss Marple had never been one to retreat, and this was no exception. Later, as the afternoon light spilled into the quiet solitude of Eleanor's study, Miss Marple's hand brushed against something unexpected, a worn envelope, tucked away in the pages of a forgotten book. She unfolded the brittle paper carefully, the image inside striking her with its weight. It was a photograph of 3 young women, their faces caught in a moment of youthful joy, but one face was violently scratched out, as if someone had tried to erase her entirely from existence. Eleanor Carrere, Cecilia Harrington, and a third woman whose identity had been obliterated, her image blotted from memory. But Miss Marple knew better than most. The past was never truly erased, and some secrets had a way of clawing their way back to the surface, no matter how hard people tried to bury them. The marks on the photograph were deliberate, violent, and they told a story, one that Miss Marple would uncover, piece by piece, no matter how deep the shadows stretched. The night had settled heavily over Carstairs Manor, an unspoken tension hanging in the still air, as if the very walls of the house held their breath. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, her eyes narrowed as she turned the photograph over in her hands, felt the weight of the past pressing in around her. It was clear now, this was no random tragedy, no mere accident. The third woman in the photograph had been erased, her identity scrubbed from history as if she had never existed. But some things could never be buried entirely. The blurred remnants of her face, the jagged scratches that distorted her features, were enough to tell Miss Marple that whoever had gone to such lengths to erase her, had failed. The truth was a stubborn thing. It never truly stayed hidden. The names on the back, Eleanor, Cecilia, were a clue, a trace of something far deeper, something far darker, and it was now that she was closing in on the answers. Lydia's death, the quiet warning in her voice just the night before, had been no coincidence. It had been a message, a desperate attempt to silence her before she could reveal too much. The tangled history of Carstairs Manor was far more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. And now, with each new death, each new piece of the puzzle falling into place, Miss Marple felt the invisible thread that connected them all tighten around her. She wasn't afraid, she was determined. The killer was slipping, every move, every misstep, was a crack in their perfect facade. In the garden where Lydia had been found, the air still thick with the aftermath of her death, Miss Marple stood among the disturbed earth, her mind piecing together the scattered clues. This wasn't a crime born of emotion, it was calculated, years in the making. The past was being erased, one life at a time, but Miss Marple would not let it happen. She had seen too much, understood too much to turn away now. The killer was not just trying to bury the truth, they were trying to bury her, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting them succeed. As the fire crackled softly behind her, she carefully folded the photograph, and tucked it into her coat pocket, feeling the cold weight of its significance. Time was running out for them, and for Miss Marple, it was only a matter of time before she would expose them all. She could feel the impending shift, the inevitable unraveling. Somewhere out there, in the dark of the night, the murderer was watching, waiting for her to make a mistake, but it would be them who faltered. Miss Marple had already seen the pattern. Too many threads had been left dangling, too many secrets left unguarded. The killer was growing desperate, and desperation often leads to mistakes. The next move, the next clue would be her victory. The puzzle was nearing completion. She had been patient, but now the endgame had begun, and there would be no escaping the truth. The truth, after all, was always the one thing no one could erase. Miss Marple sat motionless in her chair, the faint crackle of the fire her only company, but it was not the fire that held her attention. No, she had heard it, The faintest of sounds, a creak of wood under careful weight, the subtle shuffle of footsteps across the floor. Someone was moving in the house, deliberately quiet, their presence carefully orchestrated as if they knew she would be listening. She didn't stir, only listened. The soft rustle of papers, the quiet pull of drawers opening and closing, the muted clink of something being set down with cautious precision. Whoever it was, they weren't simply searching, they were desperate, too hasty, as if time were closing in on them. Then, as swiftly as they had come, the house fell silent again. The footsteps faded, and Miss Marple exhaled softly, her eyes still fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. She knew fear when she heard it, and this was fear, fear enough to risk exposure. Fear, she knew, often led even the most composed of individuals to make mistakes. She set her book aside, her mind already working, and it wasn't long before her eyes fell upon Dr. Miles Barton. There was something different about him today, a tension in his posture, a guardedness in his expression, that had not been there before. She watched him, calm as ever, but she could see the crack in the veneer. She smiled faintly. "I imagine the recent events have been distressing for you, Doctor," she remarked casually, settling herself in her chair. Barton forced a smile, but there was a coldness in it that didn't reach his eyes. "For all of it, Miss Marple," he replied stiffly. Miss Marple didn't press him immediately. Instead she placed the photograph on the table between them, the one of Eleanor, Cecilia, and the third woman whose face had been carefully scratched out. Barton's reaction was instantaneous. His eyes flickered to the photograph, then away, his throat tightening. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her gaze fixed on him, until finally, the facade cracked, just slightly. "You knew her," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Barton's breath caught. He exhaled, a nervous laugh escaping him, though it sounded forced. "Miss Marple, I hardly see how this is relevant," he said, his voice betraying a hint of discomfort. But Miss Marple said nothing, only watched, her silence as much a tool as any question. Another silence followed, thicker now, stretching longer, until finally, something shifted in Barton's demeanor. Not guilt, not yet, but something darker. Fear. Miss Marple noticed the twitch of his fingers, the way his left eye flickered nervously when he spoke. "I was engaged to Cecilia," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper, reluctant but resigned. Before she disappeared." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, and she tilted her head slightly, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "Before she disappeared," she repeated. Barton shifted uncomfortably, his fingers moving to adjust his cufflinks, a nervous tick that Miss Marple had already noted. "You mean before she died," she corrected softly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he continued in a defensive tone, "I had nothing to do with her disappearance, Miss Marple." She didn't speak at once. Instead she observed him, the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his jaw clenched, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his eyes when he spoke. His composure was unraveling, thread by thread, and Miss Marple knew it. "Of course, Doctor," she said, her voice light, almost friendly, but with the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. "But every time you deny your involvement, you touch your collar." "Fascinating, really," she continued, a mild smile playing on her lips, a little nervous tick, perhaps. Dr. Barton stiffened, his face hardening as his hand instinctively moved to his collar. "I beg your pardon," he asked, his voice sharp now, though it didn't reach his eyes. Miss Marple, unmoved, watched him with a quiet patience. The game was afoot, and Dr. Barton, for all his careful control, was beginning to show the cracks. Barton let out a hollow, forced laugh, the sound tinged with incredulity, almost as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "That's absurd," he said, his words laced with a touch of disdain. Miss Marple, unshaken, tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp with the weight of unspoken truths. "Perhaps," she replied softly, her voice barely more than a murmur, "but I wonder, Doctor, are you denying something to me, or to yourself?" The silence between them grew thick, heavy with tension, the air hanging suspended with the weight of her words. Miss Marple could feel it, a shift in the man before her. It was not guilt that plagued him, not yet at least, but something far more potent, fear. Fear of what he might be forced to confront, of the truth that he had so long kept buried. The mystery, she knew, had many layers, each one more intricate and dangerous than the last. Cecilia's disappearance, Elena's relentless pursuit of the truth, Lydia's untimely death, and now Dr. Barton. Each piece of the puzzle formed a picture, but it was still incomplete, the edges blurry, some parts just out of reach. Miss Marple studied him, her gaze unyielding. His discomfort was palpable, but it wasn't just his nerves that she was reading. It was his reluctance to face the past, a past that he had spent years trying to forget. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and graceful, and gave him a soft, almost sympathetic smile. "I do appreciate your time, Doctor," she said, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a casual chat. Dr. Barton hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening, as though he were considering saying more, but in the end, he simply nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line of resolve. Miss Marple stepped outside into the cool evening air, her mind already weaving together the disparate strands of the mystery. Dr. Barton was hiding something, she could feel it, and whatever it was, the truth was about to break free, no matter how long it had been buried. The answer had been there all along, scattered in the margins of Elena's journals, buried beneath decades of misdirection. But now, Miss Marple could see the threads slowly coming together, unraveling the lies one by one. Elena had intended for her fortune to go to Cecilia Harrington, not to Julian, nor distant relatives, not to charities, or trustees, but to Cecilia. Miss Marple carefully examined the brittle pages of an old unsigned will she had uncovered, a document long hidden beneath meaningless financial records. Elena had known it was dangerous, and it had proven to be just that. For if Cecilia had disappeared before the will could be executed, then everything, every last penny, had fallen into the hands of someone else, someone who had benefited greatly from Cecilia's absence. The motive was clear now, unmistakable, and Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder, had Elena, in her final days, remembered the mistake she had made? Had she realized the crime that had remained unchallenged for 30 years, and had that knowledge cost her life? The past, Miss Marple knew, never stayed buried for long. It clawed its way to the surface, no matter how hard one tried to keep it hidden. She turned her thoughts back to the old boathouse that stood at the edge of the lake, its timbers warped and weathered by time and neglect. It had been here decades ago that Cecilia Harrington had last been seen. Miss Marple stepped carefully inside, the musty scent of damp wood and forgotten memories thick in the air. The place had been abandoned for years, left to decay like a secret no one wanted to confront. But secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a habit of lingering. Her fingers brushed against the dusty shelves, her eyes scanning every corner, every beam, every floorboard, looking for any clue that time had failed to erase. Elena had believed Cecilia had not drowned that night, that she had lived on beyond it. If she was right, there had to be proof, something tangible that time had overlooked. Miss Marple's sharp eyes locked onto the floorboards near the far wall, where they seemed slightly uneven, disturbed long ago. Kneeling down, she pressed her hand against the wood. It shifted under her touch, loose, as if something was hidden beneath. The past was no longer content to remain in the shadows. With careful precision she pried up the loosened plank, her hand steady and methodical. And then, nestled in the dust and decay of forgotten years, she found it, a brooch. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the dirt. The design was intricate, a delicate silver setting worn with age, but unmistakably beautiful. At its center, a single faded engraving caught her eye, to Cecilia. The brooch, once a cherished gift, now lay as a silent testament to the truth, a truth that was about to be uncovered, no matter how deeply it had been buried. Miss Marple stood motionless in the dimly lit room, her heart thundering as the brooch, now firmly clasped in her hand, revealed a truth long buried. The delicate silver, worn and etched with age, gleamed faintly beneath her fingers, a haunting testament to the past. The engraving, though faded, still spoke clearly to Cecilia, a message long forgotten yet powerful enough to unravel the very fabric of the mystery she had been chasing for years. This was no mere piece of jewelry, it was the final link to Cecilia Harrington's fate. It was here, hidden beneath the floorboards, tucked away by time and secrets that Cecilia had hidden, or perhaps tried to escape, from something far darker than anyone had dared to imagine. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she slowly pieced together the fragments. A woman who had vanished without a trace, presumed dead, her disappearance shrouded in the murk of silence and lies. But here, in this forsaken room, the past could no longer be contained. The brooch, with its hidden inscription, spoke not of a drowning but of a deliberate act. Someone had ensured Cecilia never made it out alive. The tension in the air was palpable as Julian Carstairs stormed into the room, his face twisted in anger, followed by Henry Forsyte, whose usual composure had splintered into something far more fragile. Julian's voice rang out, sharp and furious, as he accused Miss Marple of meddling in affairs best left undisturbed. But she, calm and unyielding, returned his gaze with a serenity that only masked the sharpness of her mind. Her questions cut deeper than his anger, and when Julian finally snapped, revealing more than he intended, Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "We buried her." The words hung in the air, suffocating the room. Not a drowning, not an accident. A burial. Cecilia had not perished in the water, she had been silenced, buried by the very people who should have protected her. The revelation sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. She had known it, suspected it, but hearing the truth now so openly confessed was a sharp blow. Her gaze flicked between Julian and Henry, both of them standing as though rooted in place, unable to escape the weight of their shared guilt. One of them had killed Cecilia, and now, through the echoes of time, her truth was clawing its way back to the surface. Elena, it seemed, had known, perhaps not in its entirety, but she had suspected something enough to hide the will that would have given Cecilia everything. And when she had finally tried to speak, she had been silenced, her life snuffed out like a candle in the dark. Miss Marple's breath was steady, her mind racing through the intricate web of deceit, and she realized with chilling certainty that the game was almost over. The final piece was in place, and she would not stop until the full truth was exposed. The walls of Carstairs Manor seemed to close in around her as she sat at the heart of it all, watching the faces before her. Julian, pale and shaken, could no longer hide his fear. Henry, too composed for his own good, had lost the battle to maintain his calm. Alice Forsyte, the quiet observer, was perhaps the only one who had not yet cracked under the weight of their collective lies. The grandfather clock ticked on, its rhythm like the beating of an inevitable drum, counting down the seconds until everything, every dark secret would be laid bare. Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering as she took in the silent tension. The pieces had fallen into place, and now she would make them see it. The truth, buried so deep, would not stay hidden much longer. The final chapter was almost upon them, and she would ensure that justice, no matter how long it had taken, was finally done. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, the rhythmic sound carrying an eerie calm that belied the storm swirling just beneath the surface. She looked up, her gaze steady, sharp as ever, as she spoke, breaking the silence with words that could shatter the fragile peace they had tried to maintain for so long. 30 years ago, a young woman named Cecilia Harrington vanished. Officially, they said it was a drowning, she said, her voice steady but laced with something deeper, a quiet certainty that sent a ripple of unease through the room. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in, before continuing. But Elena Carstairs never believed that, and neither do I. Her gaze lingered on Julian, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and then moved to Henry, whose lips tightened into a grim line. Alice sat frozen, her eyes wide with something akin to dread, as if she already knew what was coming. Miss Marple didn't wait for them to respond. 2 deaths later, she continued, I think we can all agree Cecilia's story did not end in that lake. A sharp intake of breath from Henry filled the room, but Miss Marple pressed on, undeterred. Elena Carstairs spent years trying to right a terrible wrong, she said, her tone gentle but implacable. She knew what had truly happened to Cecilia, and she knew who was responsible. That knowledge cost her everything, her life. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken truths, and it was in that tense moment that Miss Marple turned her unblinking gaze upon Alice. "It was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Forsyte?" The words landed with the force of a blow, shattering the fragile facade Alice had so carefully constructed. Her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair, knuckles white. "This is absurd," she said, her voice steady but brittle, betraying her growing panic. "I had nothing to do with any of this." Miss Marple's lips curled into a small, almost apologetic smile, as if she regretted the truth she was about to reveal. "You were Cecilia's closest friend," she said softly. "You knew her secrets. And when Elena remembered the truth and tried to reveal it, you silenced her." The room was silent as the weight of Miss Marple's words sank in. Julian muttered something under his breath, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from Alice's face, now pale and drawn. "Secrets," Miss Marple mused, her voice cool and collected, "have a way of clinging to those who try to bury them." Her eyes flicked to the photograph, with the face scratched out, the brooch hidden in the floorboards, and the hidden will. The will, the photograph, the brooch, all of it led back to you. Alice's face drained of color as the carefully constructed wall around her began to crack. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice almost tender but unwavering. "Oh, but I do," she said gently. "You weren't protecting yourself, were you? You were protecting someone else." For a moment Alice said nothing, then as if a dam had broken, her voice trembled with the weight of years of guilt and sorrow. "I had no choice," she confessed, her hands trembling in her lap. "She was going to ruin everything. Cecilia fell in love with the wrong man. She thought love would protect her, but it didn't." Alice's face contorted in pain as she continued. "She came to me, begged me to help her. But if she had told the truth, it wouldn't have just ruined him. It would have destroyed all of us." Her voice cracked and the room seemed to close in on her. "I couldn't let her do that." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "So you silenced her." Alice buried her face in her hands, the weight of 30 years of secrets finally breaking her composure. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." But she wouldn't stop, she wouldn't listen. The silence stretched long, broken only by Alice's quiet sobs. Julian, his face ashen, stared at the floor, unable to look anyone in the eye. Henry sat motionless, his expression unreadable, his usual cool demeanor gone, replaced by something darker. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting forgotten as she looked down at Alice. "Elena spent her life trying to atone for her silence," she said softly. "She carried the weight of that night until it cost her everything." She paused, her voice now tinged with quiet regret. "But she never gave up." Alice lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red, tears still streaming down her face. "I just wanted it all to go away," she whispered. Miss Marple's gaze softened, her expression one of sorrow and understanding. "The truth never goes away, my dear," she said quietly. "And now at last the mystery that has haunted this house for 30 years is finally laid to rest." Elena Carstairs had spent her final years trapped beneath the crushing weight of a truth she could never escape. She had known what happened to Cecilia, perhaps not all of it at first, but enough to understand the injustice that had been committed. And though she had tried in her own way to make amends through the hidden will, the secret inquiries, the cryptic letters, her silence had allowed the darkness to endure. But now with Alice's confession, the truth was free. Elena had not forgotten, and now neither would they. But as Miss Marple well understood, guilt was a dangerous thing. It twisted the mind, made people reckless, desperate, and in some cases willing to do anything to protect their secrets. In Elena's case it had turned her into a target, but her murder had not been the result of a passion gone wrong or a vengeful act. It had been a cold, calculated decision, made out of a need for preservation. Someone had wanted her silence, just as Cecilia's had been forcibly silenced all those years ago. What Elena hadn't accounted for, however, was that no matter how deep a secret was buried, the past had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. And now, after so many years, the truth had been unearthed, spilling forth like a torrent of poison. Miss Marple sat in the stillness of her modest cottage, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The case was over, the guilty were unmasked and some form of justice had been served. But even with the weight of closure on her shoulders, an unfamiliar heaviness settled deep within her. She had always believed that truth was sacred, that exposing the darkness, no matter how painful, was a duty. But now, as the embers of the fire glowed softly in the quiet of the night, she wondered if Cecilia, in her youth and innocence, had believed the same. Had she thought the truth would protect her, only to discover that some secrets refused to be unearthed without catastrophic consequences? Miss Marple sighed, her fingers curling around the edges of the worn knitting needles in her lap. In the end, she knew she would always pursue the truth. It was in her nature, a part of her that could never be changed. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, when she questioned whether it was always the right thing to do. The photograph lay before her on the table, 3 young women captured in a single frozen moment. Elena poised and watchful, her gaze heavy with secrets. Cecilia, bright-eyed, unaware of the fate that was to befall her. And Alice Forsyte, once a friend, now something altogether different, twisted by fear. Miss Marple traced the edges of the photograph with a delicate finger, the years pressing in on her as she looked from one face to the next. She had solved the mystery, uncovered the truth, and yet as she stared into Cecilia's innocent face, the haunting realization gripped her: this was the closest she had ever come to failing. The past had almost won. She exhaled softly, the weight of the years, the lives lost, the secrets kept, pressing on her chest. With a final reluctant movement, she tucked the photograph away, the silence in the room thick with the unspoken truths that still lingered in the shadows. Some mysteries, like some wounds, never truly healed, and some, like Cecilia's, took far too long to be seen.